Ethan sat in his cramped apartment, surrounded by unopened bills, his phone screen flashing with notifications from his landlord. The hum of the fridge was the only sound in the otherwise quiet space, but the silence only made the weight of the past month's unpaid rent heavier on his shoulders. He rubbed his face, exhausted after yet another failed attempt at finding a job. His last paycheck had evaporated long ago, spent on gas and the occasional meal, but that didn't stop the bills from coming. His life was starting to feel like a sinking ship, and he was bailing water with his bare hands, praying for a miracle. He scrolled through the job listings again, his eyes moving mechanically over the headlines. Warehouse jobs, retail, data entry. He had applied for them all, but nothing. No responses, no callbacks. His phone had become an anchor, its silence a constant reminder of his failures. Then, a headline caught his eye. Night security guard, Crossroads Mall, high pay, unconventional duties. Ethan squinted at the ad. The phrase unconventional duties stood out like a red flag. His heart skipped a beat. He clicked on the link. The job description was simple but odd. The mall had been closed for 3 years, but they were looking for a night security guard. The pay was more than he'd ever made in his previous jobs, and the hours were from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Perfect for someone like Ethan, who had trouble finding work during the day. Must be comfortable with eccentricities. Must follow specific security protocols. Rules are non-negotiable. Only serious inquiries. Please, no time wasters. Ethan frowned, hesitating for a moment. The mall had been shut down for years, so why did it need a night security guard? And what kind of eccentricities was the ad referring to? But the more he read, the more the desperation in his stomach gnawed at him. He had no other choice. With one last glance at the bills stacked on his coffee table, Ethan tapped on the apply button. What did he have to lose? He was a day behind on his rent, and his last savings had just run out. Maybe, just maybe, this job would be his ticket out of the pit he was stuck in. 2 days later, Ethan stood in front of the Crossroads Mall, his heart thumping in his chest. It was nearly midnight. The parking lot was eerily empty, save for a few scattered cars, old, abandoned, and covered in layers of dust. The mall loomed like a dark fortress in front of him, its once vibrant exterior faded and cracked from years of neglect. Broken neon signs hung crookedly from the walls, and a chill wind blew across the asphalt, carrying the faint smell of decay. The gate was already unlocked, and Ethan stepped inside, his footsteps echoing on the cracked concrete floor. The mall felt frozen in time, with remnants of its former glory scattered throughout. Peeling posters of sales long gone, broken kiosks where vendors once hawked their goods, and empty storefronts with rusted metal gates pulled down like shuttered eyelids. The silence was deafening, like the mall had been holding its breath for years. A shadow moved near the security office, and Ethan approached cautiously. There, standing under a flickering fluorescent light, was Marcus, the day shift supervisor. He looked just as worn down as the mall itself. Graying hair, tired eyes, and a faded polo shirt that looked like it had seen better days. "You're Ethan?" Marcus asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, that's me." Marcus extended a hand. "Marcus, I'll show you the ropes." His grip was firm, but Ethan noticed the way his eyes flicked around the mall nervously, as though he were still expecting something or someone to appear from the shadows. Ethan shook Marcus's hand, and they walked toward the small security office in the corner of the mall, wedged between an old Spencer's and a jewelry store. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with only a few old monitors displaying grainy footage of empty corridors. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and dust. A single chair sat behind the desk and a small stack of papers lay there, waiting for him. "Take a seat," Marcus said. "I'll go over the rules." Ethan sat down, trying to ignore the creeping unease that filled his stomach. He wasn't sure if it was the eerie atmosphere of the mall or the pressure of the job, but something about this place didn't feel right. Marcus pulled a laminated sheet from the stack of papers and handed it to Ethan. "These are the rules. Follow them and you'll be fine. Deviate and, well, things don't go well for people who don't follow the rules." Ethan took the sheet and skimmed it. The first few rules were straightforward enough. Perform hourly walking patrols of designated areas only. Do not deviate from the prescribed route. If equipment malfunctions, continue patrol without electronic assistance. Then came the odd ones. Do not acknowledge or interact with any mannequins encountered during patrol. Report movement, today's shift supervisor only. Never turn your back on the food court after midnight. Face the seating area at all times when passing through. Mannequins, Ethan repeated, looking up at Marcus. "What does that mean?" Marcus glanced around as though making sure no one was listening. "You'll see them, just don't engage with them. That's all I'll say. And if you hear anything strange, don't investigate. Just follow the patrol route. Stick to the rules. They're there for a reason." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but Marcus didn't elaborate further. Instead, he handed him the keys to the mall and the security office and said, "Your shift starts now. I'll be around if you need anything. But remember, stick to the rules." As Marcus walked out the door, leaving Ethan alone in the dimly lit office, a wave of dread washed over him. The mall felt like a tomb, and the flickering fluorescent lights above seemed to echo the thumping of his own heartbeat. The silence was oppressive, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stood up and walked to the door, his boots tapping lightly on the floor. He grabbed his flashlight and started his first patrol. The mall stretched out in front of him, an empty wasteland of faded advertisements and broken displays. The darkness felt alive, like it was waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to break the rules. He kept walking, his flashlight beam dancing across dusty windows and abandoned store shelves. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. He passed the food court, where the old chairs and tables were arranged as if waiting for an invisible crowd. The silence was deafening, and he felt an odd, inexplicable urge to look behind him. But the rules flashed in his mind. Never turn your back on the food court after midnight. Ethan shook off the unease and continued his patrol. But the further he walked, the more the mall began to feel off. The rules felt heavier now, as though they were shaping the very air he breathed. And as the minutes ticked by, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he wasn't alone in the mall anymore. The low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound as Ethan continued his patrol through the darkened halls of the Crossroads Mall. He adjusted his flashlight, its beam flickering slightly as if struggling against the oppressive weight of the silence. His mind kept drifting back to the sheet of rules Marcus had handed him earlier. Don't interact with mannequins. Never turn your back on the food court after midnight. Stick strictly to the patrol route. If an equipment malfunction occurs, don't leave your post. These rules, simple and bizarre in equal measure, were meant to keep him safe, Marcus had said. But the more he thought about them, the less they made sense. What kind of mall needed rules like this? Why couldn't he interact with the mannequins? And what could possibly be so dangerous about the food court at night? The more Ethan walked, the more the emptiness around him seemed to grow. His boots echoed through the cavernous hallways, the only sound in the vast expanse of abandoned storefronts and dark corners. The dim light from his flashlight barely reached the farthest edges of the concourse, and every shadow seemed to shift as he moved, like the building itself was holding its breath. As he rounded the corner near the old Radio Shack, Ethan caught a glimpse of something in the periphery of his vision, a mannequin. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but as he turned to face it, his stomach dropped. The mannequin outside the old women's clothing store wasn't positioned where it had been a few minutes ago. It was standing straighter now, its plastic arm reaching out as if it had been frozen mid-step, but Ethan was certain it hadn't been that way before. He glanced at the rules in his mind, remembering Marcus's warning. Do not acknowledge or interact with mannequins. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. He forced himself to look away and kept walking, keeping his gaze fixed on the route ahead. But his mind wandered back to the mannequin. He couldn't help but feel that it had been watching him, its unblinking eyes following his every move. He pushed the thought aside and checked his watch. It was 12:10 a.m. The food court wasn't far ahead, and the strange rules kept repeating in his mind, especially one: never turn your back on the food court after midnight. The food court was usually a bustling, noisy place filled with food stands, but now it was completely still. The tables were arranged as though people had just left, the half-empty trays still on some of them, the cups half filled with whatever last drink had been consumed. A paper napkin fluttered gently on one of the tables, but there was no breeze. Ethan stopped at the entrance, scanning the dark space with his flashlight. The shadows danced unnervingly as the beam passed over the abandoned food counters and closed stalls. He hesitated, his mind racing. Never turn your back on the food court after midnight. He didn't understand why this rule was so specific, but something in his gut told him not to risk it. He turned his body slightly, his eyes never leaving the seating area, even as he moved around the perimeter of the food court. He could feel the tension in his muscles as he obeyed the rule, even though he didn't fully comprehend it. The silence was unbearable. As Ethan continued along the route, his flashlight beam flickering intermittently, his mind began to replay the rest of the rules. Stick strictly to the patrol route. That one, at least, seemed simple enough. He wasn't about to wander off, not with the strange feeling that something might be waiting for him if he did. His eyes flicked to the worn map he had been given, marking out his designated areas. He had been told to patrol the main concourse, then head toward the old Sears store, the department store that had been long closed. As he followed the route, the emptiness around him seemed to become even more pronounced. The more familiar stores, the ones with faded signs that once heralded a thriving mall, now felt like ghosts of their former selves, and the aisles stretched endlessly before him like a labyrinth. Ethan's thoughts began to drift as he passed the old Montgomery ward, now gutted and turned into a large storage area. A chill crawled up his spine as he passed the broken windows of the former department store. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of movement just beyond his flashlight's beam. He froze, his heartbeat thudding in his chest. It was nothing, or at least he hoped it was. He forced himself to look away, continuing on the prescribed route. The rule about staying on course wasn't hard to follow, But the weight of the other rules, the ones that didn't make sense, was starting to settle heavily on his shoulders. His flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. Ethan cursed under his breath. The batteries had been fresh when he started his shift. He fumbled with the flashlight, twisting it in his hand, trying to coax some light back from the dead device. When it didn't work, he reluctantly pulled out his phone and checked the time. 1:05 a.m. This was it, the equipment malfunction rule. Ethan remembered what Marcus had said. If an equipment malfunction occurs, don't leave your post. He had no idea what constituted a malfunction in Marcus's eyes, but he didn't want to risk breaking any more rules. He had barely been at the mall for 2 hours, and already he felt trapped by the guidelines he barely understood. Was it a malfunction, or was the mall doing something to mess with him? In the silence, he could hear the faint whine of the mall's ventilation system, the soft hiss of air moving through the ducts. The mall was still alive in its own way, even if the lights were out. Ethan's mind couldn't stop wandering to the other rules. Never turn your back on the food court after midnight. He had obeyed that one. Stick to the patrol route. That one he had followed too. Do not interact with mannequins. He had seen one move, but he couldn't break the rule. He hadn't acknowledged it. That was the key, wasn't it? He had to stick to the rules, no matter how odd they seemed. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his spiraling thoughts. He pulled it out, surprised to see a text from Marcus. "How's it going? Everything good?" Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen, uncertain. Should he tell Marcus about the flickering light, about the strange feeling in the air, about the mannequin that had been too close for comfort? He didn't want to sound crazy. Besides, Marcus had warned him to follow the rules, and the text felt like a test. He typed back, "Yeah, everything's fine, just getting used to the place." Seconds later, Marcus's reply came, "Good, stay on track. If anything seems off, don't deviate from your route. Trust me." Ethan put the phone away, the words "trust me" lingering in his mind. He wasn't sure if Marcus was trying to reassure him or warn him. Either way, the rules were clear. No exceptions, no questions. As Ethan continued through the dark corridors of the mall, the silence seemed heavier. Each shadow felt like it was breathing, watching him. He focused on the faint echo of his footsteps, trying to drown out the unsettling sounds creeping from every direction. The flicker of the flashlight was gone, and the dim emergency lighting bathed the mall in an eerie yellow glow. The sense of unease grew stronger with each passing minute. He passed the old Victoria's Secret store and glanced at the display window, still showing lingerie, now faded and covered in dust. He didn't want to look, but his eyes lingered for a moment too long. Just as he turned to continue, something caught his eye movement in the periphery of his vision. A mannequin, the one in the store window. This time, he didn't just feel it watching him, he saw it. Its arm twitched. Ethan stood still in the middle of the main concourse, feeling the silence close in around him like a thick blanket. The only sound was the steady, low hum of the mall's ancient ventilation system, filtering through the dust-filled air. His flashlight beam swept back and forth as he began his first patrol, but the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, shifting in ways that made the air feel colder with every passing step. The mall had been closed for years, yet it felt as if the entire place was frozen in time. Every store he passed, from the old Radio Shack with its "going out of business" banner to the Spencer's Gifts, which still displayed novelty items as though the last customers had just left, seemed trapped in a ghostly stillness. The windows were coated with a thin layer of dust, and faded posters clung weakly to the walls, advertising long-forgotten sales and events. Yet, there was a sense of something lingering in the air, something that didn't belong. As Ethan moved forward, he noticed the mannequins in the windows of several stores. They were all posed in lifelike stances, but something about them made his skin crawl. They stood frozen, their empty eyes staring out at the vast, empty hallways as if waiting for something or someone. He felt it again, a chill at the back of his neck. He glanced to his left at the display window of a clothing store where a mannequin stood, its eyes fixed directly on him. The figure was dressed in a long, flowing coat, its head tilted just slightly as if it had been caught mid-turn. Ethan quickly looked away, forcing himself to focus on the path ahead. He couldn't break the rule. He remembered Marcus's warning, don't acknowledge or interact with any mannequins. He quickened his pace, but his unease only deepened. It wasn't just the mannequins that made him uncomfortable, it was the oppressive quiet, the way the place seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for something to happen. It was as if the mall itself was aware of his presence, watching him from every corner, every shadow. His path led him past the closed food court, and for a moment he hesitated. The mall's layout was simple, a broad corridor leading directly to the food court, with the old department stores branching off on either side. But the food court was different. It wasn't just a space filled with empty tables and chairs. It felt wrong. The tables were arranged exactly as they would be during operating hours, but the chairs were pulled back at odd angles, some turned sideways, others facing the wrong direction entirely. The remnants of fast food trays and paper cups were left scattered across the tables, as if people had suddenly stood up and walked away in a hurry. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. It was the same feeling he'd had when he first saw the mannequin in the clothing store. The sense that something was out of place, that something had happened here that shouldn't have. The smell in the air was faint but unmistakable. It was the stale, artificial scent of old food mixed with something metallic, something unsettling. The lights above flickered once, casting long, jagged shadows across the room, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the room was far too still, far too quiet. He stepped into the food court, his flashlight illuminating the faded signs above each food stall, all of them long out of service. Burger King, Taco Bell, and a small Chinese restaurant, all abandoned. The food court, which should have been a vibrant hub of activity, now stood as a desolate shell of its former self. A large, empty fountain sat in the center of the room, its once sparkling waters long drained, leaving only stained concrete behind. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense of expectation. Ethan's flashlight swept across the tables, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw something move. A chair scraping gently against the floor, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. He stopped. His heart raced. He turned his head quickly, shining the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. No person, no figure, just empty chairs, abandoned and still. But it wasn't the sound that bothered him. It was the way the tables were arranged. It was as if the chairs had been left in a hurry, scattered carelessly, as though someone had been in the middle of eating when something had caused them to abandon their meal and flee. The setup felt wrong in a way that he couldn't explain, and the longer he stood there, the more he felt the presence of something, someone, just out of view, waiting, watching. He forced himself to turn away from the food court. The rules came back to him like a mantra. Don't acknowledge anything out of the ordinary. Stick to the patrol route. Don't let the strange feelings distract you. He walked past the food court, keeping his eyes straight ahead, focused on the next checkpoint. The old department store which had once been Sears. The faded sign above the entrance swayed slightly in the breeze that whispered through the broken windows, its creaking noise another reminder of the mall's decay. As he passed the food court's entrance, the odd feeling that he wasn't alone persisted. He could feel the air shifting behind him, but he didn't dare look back. Instead, he focused on the route just as Marcus had instructed. He repeated the rules in his head like a litany, trying to quiet the nagging voice in the back of his mind that urged him to run, to escape the oppressive silence. Don't break the rules. Don't turn your back. Don't interact with the mannequins. But the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave him. The mall, once bustling with life, now felt like a tomb. The atmosphere pressed in on him, the weight of the silence growing thicker with each step. He rounded the corner toward the old Sears anchor store, the next checkpoint on his route. The once grand store was now little more than a hollow shell. The display windows had been smashed long ago, leaving jagged shards of glass scattered on the ground. Inside, the shelves were bare, the walls stripped of everything except the echoes of a time long gone. The flashlight beam bounced off the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to shift as if alive. Ethan stepped cautiously into the darkened store, his heart pounding in his chest. His flashlight swept across the desolate space, and something caught his eye: movement. A mannequin. It was at the far end of the store, standing in front of what had once been the men's clothing section. The mannequin was dressed in a suit, its plastic face frozen in a vacant expression. But this one was different from the others. Ethan had seen the mannequins in the storefronts, but none of them had seemed alive in this way. The mannequin in the old department store stood too still, too perfectly placed, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he couldn't move. The mannequin's eyes were fixed on him, no watching him. It felt as though it was waiting for something, anticipating his next move. Don't interact with mannequins. Don't acknowledge them. The words of the rule rang in Ethan's head like a warning bell. He forced his eyes away from the mannequin, his breath shallow. His body was telling him to move, to turn around and get out of there, but he knew the rules. He couldn't break them. Not now. Not when everything already felt so wrong. Ethan turned and continued his patrol, the flicker of the mannequin's gaze still haunting him. He didn't dare look back, but the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him lingered in the air, just out of reach. Ethan's footsteps echoed down the long corridors of Crossroads Mall, his heart pounding as the oppressive silence pressed in around him. He had long since passed the food court, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead, his mind focused on the route he had to complete. The rules were clear in his mind, and so far he had followed them without deviation. But the deeper he went into the mall, the more it felt like something was subtly shifting in the atmosphere, something that wasn't quite right. The lights overhead flickered again, causing him to pause mid-step. For a moment, the entire concourse was plunged into darkness before the lights came back on, buzzing and flickering like an old, dying fluorescent bulb. Ethan blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and shook his head. Just a malfunction, he told himself. The mall had been abandoned for years. Of course, the lights weren't going to work properly. He continued walking, trying to ignore the growing feeling of unease in his gut. But it wasn't just the flickering lights. There was something about the air, the heaviness of it, like it was thick with secrets that the walls had kept locked away for too long. The sound of his own breathing felt too loud in the quiet, and the flickering lights above him seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own, like they were syncing with his heartbeats. Another flicker. Ethan froze. This time, the light stayed dim for a few seconds longer than usual, casting deep shadows across the mall. He glanced up at the flickering overhead lights, but before he could process what he was seeing, his flashlight sputtered and went out entirely. "Great," he muttered under his breath, tapping it against his palm, willing the light to return. His pulse quickened as he realized how much darker it had become with the flashlight off. It was disorienting. The mall felt like it was closing in on him, its long hallways now swallowed by impenetrable shadows. He pulled out his phone and checked the time, 1:45 a.m. He had been patrolling for nearly 2 hours now. Despite the eerie feeling creeping over him, he knew he needed to keep going. The rules were clear. He wasn't supposed to leave his post for any reason unless it was a serious emergency. And this wasn't an emergency. This was just a little malfunction. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and started walking again. The flashlight had worked intermittently before, so he was sure it would come back on soon. He continued his route, passing by the old radio shack and the remnants of an old food court kiosk, the space now reduced to a dusty shell. As he passed by the old Sears store, however, something caught his attention, a faint movement from the corner of his eye. It was quick, too quick for him to be sure, but he swore he saw something shift in the shadowed corners of the store. His heart raced. He turned to face the old department store, shining his phone's flashlight toward the darkened interior. The beam cut through the shadows but revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He had been alone in the mall for hours now, and the silence was starting to get to him. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. His instincts screamed at him to turn around and leave, but the rules were in his head, rigid and inflexible. Stick strictly to the patrol route. He pressed on, walking past the old store and into the dark hallway that led further into the mall. But just as he reached the corner, something strange happened again. The camera feed on the monitor in the security office began to glitch. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had forgotten to check the security monitors earlier, but as he glanced up, the flickering static on the screen caught his attention. He couldn't believe what he saw. On camera 7, which was watching the Sears store, the image kept cutting to black every few seconds, followed by a brief flash of static. Ethan leaned closer to the screen, watching the distortion. It happened again, a brief flicker of light before the screen went black. Then for a split second he saw something, or rather someone, in the darkened corner of the store. A figure, standing still, unmoving. The screen went black again. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't seen anything like that before, not in the short time he had been working here. The camera wasn't malfunctioning due to a simple technical issue. This felt different. It was as if something was interfering with the feed, something that didn't want him to see what was happening in the mall. He felt a cold sweat forming on his brow. The camera feed had always worked perfectly, and he knew the rules, no deviations. But this felt wrong. He couldn't just ignore it. He grabbed the radio and quickly pressed the button. "Marcus," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's a glitch in camera 7. It keeps cutting to black. I think something's wrong with the feed." A few moments passed before Marcus's voice crackled through the static. "Don't worry about the cameras, they do that sometimes. Just keep to the route. You're doing fine." His voice was calm, almost too calm. Ethan wanted to press him for more information, to ask why the cameras were malfunctioning or what was happening in the Sears store. But Marcus cut the call off abruptly, leaving Ethan alone with his growing unease. He stared at the glitching camera feed for a few more seconds, his eyes flicking nervously between the screen and the darkness of the hallway outside. He needed to focus. He needed to keep going. But the unease had already taken root, and it only deepened with every passing moment. Ethan continued on, walking deeper into the mall, but the feeling of being watched never left him. His mind raced with every step, wondering what was happening to the cameras, to the lights, to everything around him. The rules were supposed to keep him safe, but what if the rules were the very thing keeping him trapped? And then, just as he passed the old Sears store for the second time, the sound came again. A soft rustling, a whisper almost too quiet to hear. His breath hitched and he froze in his tracks. He glanced around, his eyes darting toward the darkened storefronts, but there was no one there. Nothing. The rustling stopped. He quickly glanced back at the camera feed. This time, there was no glitch. The image was clear, but what he saw froze him in place. There was a figure now standing in the corner of the store. No longer just a shadow, it was a person, or at least something that looked like a person. A mannequin, its face twisted in a grotesque expression, standing motionless, staring directly at him through the camera. Then the screen went black again. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly turned away from the monitor and kept walking. Ethan's footsteps echoed down the silent hallways of Crossroads Mall, his nerves frazzled and on edge. The previous hours of his shift had been filled with strange occurrences, flickering lights, malfunctioning equipment, and the eerie feeling that something or someone was watching him. Every creak of the old building seemed amplified in the silence, and every shadow seemed to stretch further than it should. He tried to push it all out of his mind, focusing instead on the patrol route laid out in front of him, but the unease continued to gnaw at him. As he passed by the old Radio Shack, he saw the first mannequin again. The one he had noticed earlier, standing still outside the store, its plastic face fixed in a blank expression. Ethan had forced himself to ignore it before, to follow the rules and not acknowledge it. But now, as he passed by again, he couldn't help but feel that something had changed. The mannequin's posture was different. The arm that had been extended outward in a frozen gesture now seemed to be angled slightly downward, its fingers almost twitching. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. He didn't want to look, he couldn't look, but his eyes were drawn to the figure. It didn't move, he told himself. It can't move. Mannequins don't move. But that didn't make the sensation any less real. The unease in his stomach was back, growing heavier with every breath. His eyes flicked to the mannequin again, and it felt as though the figure was watching him, the plastic eyes following his every movement. He quickly turned his head away, refusing to look back, but the sense of something watching him wouldn't go away. He pressed on, trying to push the thought aside. He had a job to do. The patrol route was his focus now, not the mannequins, not the strange feeling that had settled into the very air of the mall. But no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, his mind kept returning to that mannequin, to the feeling that it had shifted, even if only slightly. As he continued down the hallway, passing by the closed storefronts and abandoned kiosks, the sensation of being watched intensified. He felt like a presence was hanging over him, just beyond the reach of his vision, always lurking in the corners of his mind. By the time he reached the old food court again, the air was thick with dread. The strange sounds had returned, faint scraping noises that came from the shadows in the distance. The tables in the food court still sat in their odd, scattered arrangement, but this time something was different about them. The chairs that had once been left askew now seemed to be positioned slightly closer together, as though someone had moved them while he wasn't looking. Ethan's nerves were. Ethan's pulse quickened as he stepped into the main concourse again, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadowed mall. The eerie silence that filled the space seemed to grow thicker with each passing minute. He could feel it now, that sense of being watched, a subtle pressure, like invisible eyes trailing him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He had tried to brush off the strange feelings from earlier, the unease that had built up as he noticed the mannequins shifting. It's nothing, he had told himself. It's just your mind playing tricks. But as he moved through the empty mall, those nagging thoughts wouldn't leave him. The mannequins he had passed earlier had all seemed so lifeless, frozen in their poses, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had kept walking, his eyes forced straight ahead, determined not to let the paranoia take hold. But every corner he turned, every step he took, the feeling only grew stronger. Mannequins, they were everywhere. When he passed the food court again, Ethan felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. The layout of the space hadn't changed, but somehow everything felt off. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, erratic shadows. The empty tables and chairs sat in their usual positions, but this time it was different. The chairs, they weren't just askew like before. They were positioned with a strange purpose, as if waiting for someone to sit. His flashlight beam swept across the food court, its light bouncing off the shiny surfaces of the old, unused tables. And then he saw it. One of the mannequins was closer. Ethan's stomach twisted as he saw the mannequin in the business suit standing much closer than it had been before. It was positioned directly in the path he had just walked, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he could see its plastic eyes locked onto him. The mannequin's head was tilted slightly to the side, as though scrutinizing his every move. He froze, his breath hitching in his throat. It was exactly as it had been before, but different. The sense of being observed had intensified. The mannequin's arm, once outstretched and reaching for the far-off edge of the table, was now bent at a sharp angle, almost as if it were beckoning him. Ethan's mind screamed at him to turn away, to ignore it, but he couldn't. Something about its eyes, those lifeless plastic orbs, sent a chill down his spine. Just keep walking, he told himself. He forced himself to take a step forward. His legs felt like lead, unwilling to move, but the rules raced through his mind. Don't interact with the mannequins. That rule had felt strange at first, almost like a joke, but now, in the oppressive stillness of the mall, it felt like a matter of survival. His footsteps echoed louder in the food court as he passed the mannequin, the only sound in the vast emptiness. He didn't dare glance at it again, but the feeling of its gaze remained. The rules were clear. Don't acknowledge the mannequins. He swallowed hard and forced his eyes straight ahead, trying to block out the creeping sense of paranoia. But as he walked further, he couldn't help but feel that something had changed. The mannequins in the food court, they were no longer where he had seen them earlier. He had passed at least 5 mannequins since entering, but the eerie feeling didn't stop. His eyes darted back to the food court. The mannequin dressed in a business suit. It was standing even closer, its stiff hand now pointed toward him. It was no longer just a random figure in the window, it had become a presence. The rules buzzed in his mind again. Do not acknowledge them. Do not react. Do not break the protocol. His heart raced as he moved quickly past the food court, not daring to look back. His mind was spinning, a whirl of confusion and dread. What was happening to him? Why was he so afraid of something as simple as a mannequin? But he couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play here, something more than just abandoned mall furniture. Ethan tried to push the thought out of his head, but the sense of being followed never left him. He reached the far end of the concourse and turned the corner toward the old department store, the vast and empty space of the mall stretching out before him like a graveyard. He looked at his watch. It was 12:15 a.m. The clock in the security office had been ticking relentlessly for hours, and each second seemed to drag on longer than the last. The haunting stillness of the place had become a suffocating presence, like the mall was slowly closing in on him. As he neared the food court again, he was drawn to it once more, like a moth to a flame. He didn't want to go in, but the unease pulling at him was unbearable. His steps slowed as he approached the entrance of the food court once again. A shiver ran through him as he turned his head to glance into the darkness. He saw nothing at first, just the scattered tables and chairs, the faded signs above the closed stalls, but then the sound. A faint scraping noise. It came from behind him. A chair. Sliding across the tile floor, a soft, eerie sound that made his heart stop. It was as though someone had dragged a chair across the floor in a slow, deliberate motion, its metal legs screeching against the tile. Ethan's breath hitched as he spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping through the dark food court, illuminating empty chairs and vacant tables. Nothing was there, just the empty space. He stared into the shadows, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. Had it been his imagination? Had he just heard things in the quiet? No, he could feel it. The presence, the lingering feeling of being watched. The mannequin. The one in the business suit, it was closer now. Just a few steps away, its face eerily tilted toward him. Ethan turned away from the food court and quickened his pace, heart pounding in his chest. Just keep going, just keep going. He repeated the mantra in his head like a lifeline. Don't acknowledge the mannequins. Don't let fear take over. The rules were his only guide, and right now they felt like his last chance at survival. But his footsteps felt heavier now, the tension too thick to ignore. With each passing moment, the feeling of being pursued, of being hunted, only deepened. The rest of the patrol passed in a blur. Ethan tried to concentrate on the route, moving through the mall's empty halls, but the oppressive sense of dread refused to leave him. The mannequins seemed to be everywhere now, and every time he looked away, every time he moved past another one, he was certain they had shifted, had moved just a little bit closer. The weight of the rules, the endless tension, the paranoia growing in his chest, it all felt too much to bear. At 12:45 a.m., Ethan passed by the food court one last time, determined to finish his route without breaking the rules. But when he looked over at the mannequin in the business suit, he swore it was smiling. Ethan's hands were shaking as he gripped the radio. The static buzzed in his ear, the silence between the crackles making his heart beat faster. His mind raced with the strange events of the last few hours, the mannequins moving, the eerie noises in the food court, the cameras glitching out. It was all too much to ignore now. He needed answers. He needed someone to tell him he wasn't losing his mind. With a deep breath, he pressed the radio button. "Marcus," he said, his voice coming out shakier than he intended. I don't know what's going on. There's something wrong with the cameras and the mannequins. They keep moving. I swear they are." He hesitated, unsure if he should even say it, watching him. The words felt absurd even as they left his mouth, but the truth was inescapable. Something in the mall, something unseen, was changing. A long pause followed, the crackling static filling the air, making the silence feel even more oppressive. Ethan's eyes flicked nervously to the monitors. The feed from camera 7 had flickered again, and he could have sworn he saw a mannequin in the background shift ever so slightly, a movement he was sure hadn't been there before. Then Marcus's voice crackled through, calm and almost too calm. "Ethan, calm down," he said, the words clipped but firm. "Follow the rules. You'll be fine. Don't question what you see. Just stick to the patrol route and don't break the protocols. They exist for a reason." Ethan blinked, the words landing like a weight on his chest. Follow the rules, it was all Marcus ever seemed to say. It was maddening. Of course, he was following the rules. He was doing everything by the book, but the rules weren't enough to explain the things he was seeing. I did follow the rules," Ethan said, his voice growing a little more desperate. "But the mannequins, they're moving, and the food court, there was a noise, a chair, scraping across the floor. I swear I'm not imagining things." Another crackling silence followed his words. This time the response was slower, measured, almost as if Marcus was carefully choosing his next words. "Listen," Marcus said, his voice lower now. "The mannequins aren't what you think they are. The food court is just a place. There's no need to worry about the little things. Just don't engage with them. Don't look too closely, and definitely don't make contact. Keep moving. Stick to the plan and you'll be fine." Ethan felt the cold grip of dread tighten around his chest. "The mannequins aren't what you think they are." He looked down at the laminated sheet of rules that had been given to him. The words "do not interact with mannequins" echoed in his mind. But he had already broken that rule, hadn't he? He'd looked too closely. The first mannequin in the food court, it had shifted closer to him. It had been watching him, its stiff plastic gaze unblinking. And now, here he was, questioning his own sanity, trying to convince himself that what he was seeing wasn't real. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was growing too intense to dismiss as imagination. And Marcus wasn't giving him any answers. He was just repeating the same thing: follow the rules and you'll be fine. The next few minutes stretched on, unbearable in their silence. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and anxiety. Every shadow seemed to shift in the periphery of his vision. Every corner of the mall, once familiar, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. His steps grew heavier as he walked further, the weight of the rules bearing down on him like a constant reminder of his impotence. The food court was up ahead again, the place where the mannequins had shifted, their silent movements haunting his every thought. He had to pass through it again as part of his patrol, but this time, his mind raced with questions. Had Marcus been in on it? Was he just trying to calm him down, or was there something more to his cryptic advice? The rules exist for a reason. Ethan's stomach churned. If the mannequins weren't what he thought they were, then what were they? And why did the food court feel so alive? Why did it seem like the chairs were waiting for someone to sit in them? Every time he looked, every time he passed through, it felt like something was shifting, just beyond his reach. He found himself standing in front of the food court's entrance again. The tables were still arranged the same way, as if frozen in time. The flickering light from above cast long shadows across the empty space. The same scrape echoed faintly in his mind, like a memory that hadn't quite left. The mannequin in the business suit was there again, standing eerily close to the food court entrance, just like the last time. Its face was tilted slightly, as though it were waiting for him. The plastic arms were now bent at unnatural angles, rigid and lifeless. He stared at it for a moment longer than he intended, and in that instant the air seemed to thicken. The mannequins were moving. His eyes weren't playing tricks on him. What's going on? The question gnawed at him. The mall, once a lifeless shell, had become something else. The mannequins weren't just figures frozen in time. They were a presence. And he was certain now that they were waiting for him to make a mistake. He quickly turned his head, forcing himself to focus on the route ahead. His heart thudded in his chest, his skin prickling with the sudden awareness that he wasn't alone in the mall. Not anymore. As he walked past the food court again, the scraping sound came back, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a trick of the wind. It wasn't his imagination. Ethan spun around, his eyes scanning the food court once more. Nothing. The chairs were all still in place, as if nothing had moved. But the noise lingered, pressing into his mind like an invisible weight. He turned back, trying to ignore the feeling of the mannequin's gaze on his back, and resumed his patrol. But now, more than ever, Ethan began to understand the full meaning of the rules. They weren't just guidelines. They weren't there for his convenience. They were there to keep him safe, to keep him from breaking the one unspoken truth about this place. If you break the rules, you become part of it. That thought chilled him to the bone. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he knew one thing for sure. If he didn't follow the rules, the mall wouldn't just reject him. It would consume him. Ethan pressed on, the rules playing on a loop in his mind as he walked deeper into the darkening hallways. Every corner felt more suffocating than the last. Every step seemed to echo louder than before. The weight of the rules, the weight of the eerie silence, was pushing down on him, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could take it. He had already seen the mannequins move. He had already broken the unspoken rules by acknowledging them. Now, the only thing that remained was whether or not he could survive the consequences. Ethan's steps slowed as he ventured deeper into the darkened expanse of the mall. The walls of the concourse stretched far ahead of him, the flickering emergency lighting casting long, disjointed shadows that made the space feel unnervingly vast. He had passed the food court and the old department store hours ago, but the feeling of being watched hadn't loosened its grip on him. It only seemed to intensify the further he walked, and the oppressive silence that filled the mall was growing heavier with each passing moment. He was almost certain the mall had never felt this cold before. The temperature had dropped rapidly, a sudden chill that pierced through his jacket and made his skin tighten in discomfort. The breath he exhaled now appeared in front of him in small, misty clouds, even though the mall had never felt this cold during the daytime hours when it was still operating. The air, once thick with the stale humidity of abandonment, now felt sharp and biting. Ethan paused, his breath coming in visible puffs. He looked around, trying to shake off the growing unease that seemed to seep through the cracks of the place like cold wind. There was no reason for the temperature to have dropped so suddenly. The ventilation system wasn't running. In fact, the entire mall had been shut down for years. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of an abandoned space, surrounded by a ghostly presence that seemed to pulse in the very air around him. He took another step forward, but the cold didn't let up. The hairs on his arms stood up. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, that the isolation and the eerie quiet were starting to get to him. But the chill biting into his skin felt real. His flashlight beam wavered slightly as he moved deeper into the mall, past broken storefronts and vacant kiosks. He was supposed to follow his patrol route, but the deeper he went, the more uneasy he felt. The path seemed endless, and now it was as though the mall was pulling him further in, drawing him deeper into the heart of its darkness. As he turned the corner, he came across a small, dimly lit section of the mall. This area hadn't caught his attention before, but now, as he stepped closer, he realized what it was. A forgotten corner of the mall, lined with old photo displays. The photos, yellowed with age, showed families shopping, children laughing, and parents smiling as they posed in front of the stores that had long since closed. These were happy memories frozen in time, but something was wrong. The faces in the photographs were all scratched out, every single one. Ethan's stomach dropped. The markings were precise, like someone had gone through each picture and deliberately scraped the faces away, leaving only the blurry outlines of people where their eyes, smiles, and expressions had once been. He reached out a hand, almost instinctively, as though to touch the surface of one of the photos. But something stopped him. The air felt too thick, too charged. It was as though the space around him had suddenly become too oppressive to breathe. He stepped back, his heart racing now. The unsettling nature of the scene made his skin crawl, but he knew he had to keep moving. The rules kept echoing in his mind: stick to the route, don't deviate. But as he looked at the scratched-out faces, the eerie stillness of the space filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. The mall wasn't just abandoned, it was haunted by something more than just the passage of time. He turned to leave the section, but the chill in the air seemed to intensify. His breath misted in front of him again, and he realized he could feel it now, the subtle sensation of being followed. It wasn't just the cold air. It wasn't just his imagination. He could feel eyes on him, a pressure on his back like a pair of unseen hands were pushing him forward. He glanced behind him, his flashlight beam shaking in his grip. The dim, flickering light illuminated nothing but the empty hallway. Yet the feeling of being followed grew stronger, more insistent. Keep moving, he thought. He had to keep moving. The mannequin rule, the cameras, the strange occurrences, they all pointed to one thing. If he stopped, if he didn't follow the route and follow the rules, he would be trapped. So he kept walking, faster now, past the disorienting photos, the scratched-out faces, and the unnerving sense that something or someone was following his every step. But then it came again, a whisper. Faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. It seemed to seep through the walls, curling into his ears like an unwelcome thought. Come closer. Ethan's blood ran cold. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't his imagination. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. A whisper, a hushed call from the very walls of the mall. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Who was that? Who was speaking? The whisper grew louder, though the source remained elusive, hidden behind the walls of the mall. It was as if the building itself was breathing, speaking in a language he couldn't understand, but one that still resonated deep inside him. The words were disjointed, incoherent, but the tone was unmistakable. It was as though something was beckoning him, urging him closer. He took a hesitant step forward, but then the voice changed, became something more sinister. Don't ignore me. The words felt like they were coming from inside his skull, reverberating in his bones. The temperature dropped again, colder than before, and the shadows around him seemed to stretch and shift, moving with him as though the walls themselves were alive. Ethan stumbled backward, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The rules. The words rang in his mind like a desperate prayer. Follow the rules. Stick to the route. Don't break the protocols. Ethan forced himself to breathe slowly, to focus on the cold, clammy grip of fear that was tightening around his chest. He had to keep going. He couldn't stop. He couldn't acknowledge it, whatever it was. The whispers, the presence. He couldn't let it pull him in. He had to finish the patrol. He had to make it to the end of his shift. But the whispers followed him. And with each step, the mall seemed to close in tighter, its walls pressing closer, suffocating him. His flashlight flickered once again, casting erratic shadows across the empty space. The whispers faded into an eerie silence, and Ethan, in a haze of fear, hurried to the next checkpoint, trying to ignore the sensation that something or someone was still behind him. Every footstep echoed, but it was never his own echo that greeted him. It was as if the sound was coming from all directions at once. Follow the rules. Stick to the route. The words were becoming a mantra, a lifeline. He passed the old Sears store once more. The darkness inside seemed deeper than before. The air felt thicker, colder. But as he turned the corner, he swore he saw something moving in the shadows. It was faint, a brief flicker of movement, but enough to make his heart stop. Ethan's breath came in shallow bursts as he walked further down the corridor of the mall, the weight of the eerie stillness growing heavier with every step. The mannequins, always an unsettling presence, now felt like something more, something alive. His mind kept returning to the moments when he'd passed them, when he'd sworn they had shifted, moved, watched him from the corner of his eye. He knew the rules. Do not interact with the mannequins. Yet the more he tried to ignore them, the more they seemed to draw his attention. As he rounded a corner, he found himself standing in front of the old Spencer's store, the large gates pulled halfway down, leaving the interior of the store just barely visible. The once thriving novelty store, filled with trinkets, t-shirts, and quirky items, was now a dusty relic of the past. But even in its state of abandonment, it felt strange. Ethan paused. A strange pull tugged at him, like a magnetic force drawing him closer to the store. It was as if the store itself was waiting, expecting something or someone. He glanced through the small gap between the gates. The store was dark, the faint beam of his flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. But there, behind the counter, he saw it, the mannequin. It was unlike any mannequin he had seen in the mall so far. At first, it looked like a typical figure, stiff, lifeless, frozen in place. But as he squinted into the dim light, his stomach lurched. This one wasn't like the others. The mannequin behind the counter had depth in its eyes. It wasn't the empty, glossy stare of the others, but something that resembled life, a spark, a glimmer of something more than plastic. The mannequin's face, though frozen, seemed to watch him, its expression somehow different. Its eyes didn't have that dull, lifeless sheen of plastic. They were darker, more real. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was as if it had somehow crossed the line between mannequin and something else, something alive. Ethan's heart skipped a beat and his stomach twisted. He could feel a cold sweat gathering on his skin. His flashlight flickered again, casting erratic shadows on the mannequin's face. For a moment, the figure appeared to move. The head seemed to turn ever so slightly, just enough for Ethan to feel the sharp pang of panic lodge itself in his chest. No, his mind screamed at him to turn away, to follow the rules. He had already seen too much. The mannequin wasn't supposed to move. He was supposed to ignore it, to obey the rules that had kept him safe so far. Do not interact with mannequins. But the rules seemed to become more distant, less relevant now, as Ethan felt himself inexplicably drawn toward the mannequin. The rule had been simple when the figures had been distant, lifeless. But this one was different. There was something human in its gaze, or perhaps more terrifyingly, something aware. His feet shifted, almost against his will. Slowly, he moved closer to the store, compelled by something beyond his control. His eyes remained fixed on the mannequin, but he couldn't tear himself away. It was as if the figure was waiting for him, its eyes following his every movement with an unnatural intensity. His heart pounded in his chest, and a faint voice echoed in his mind. Don't interact. Don't break the rule. He hesitated for a moment, just outside the gap in the gate, trying to summon the willpower to turn away. But he couldn't. The mannequin's gaze was like a pull, a force that was drawing him in despite the overwhelming urge to flee. His flashlight beam flickered again, illuminating the mannequin's face with an unsettling clarity. It wasn't just staring at him. It was as though it was waiting for him to make the next move. The mannequin's mouth was slightly parted, its expression just a little too perfect, as if it had been posed deliberately, or worse, as if it had been waiting for him to pass by. His pulse quickened and he took a step backward. He needed to obey the rules. Don't interact with the mannequins. He repeated it in his head like a mantra, but the word interaction seemed more ambiguous now. Was it really just about not talking to them, or was it about acknowledging them? As he turned to leave, the mannequin's gaze seemed to follow him, its eyes locked onto his back. He felt its stare digging into him, trailing him as he moved away. He couldn't shake the sensation that it was alive, that it was aware of him in a way the other mannequins hadn't been. The rule had never seemed more important or more frightening than it did in that moment. Don't break the rule. Don't acknowledge them. But as Ethan turned to face the direction of his next checkpoint, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake. The mannequin had seen him, and somehow it had felt him. The cold fingers of dread crept up his spine, crawling like icy tendrils into his chest. The rest of the mall seemed to stretch on indefinitely as he continued his patrol, but the eerie presence of the mannequin haunted him. Every corner he turned, every shadow that moved in his peripheral vision, felt like a reminder of what he had just seen. The store, the mannequin, its gaze. It had all followed him, and now he was left with the suffocating knowledge that there was something not quite right about this place. As he moved down the long, empty halls, the silence around him seemed even more profound. Every sound he made, every footstep, every breath felt amplified, like the mall was listening to him, waiting. His mind raced with questions. What had he just witnessed? Why was the mannequin different? Why had it looked so real? And most terrifying of all, was he the only one who saw it? When Ethan reached the next part of the mall, he quickly checked the security monitors, trying to distract himself from the paranoia gnawing at him. As his eyes flicked over the screens, his gaze froze on camera 7, the one that watched the front of Spencer's. For a moment, the screen was black, the static flickering as it had earlier. But then, the camera feed cleared, and Ethan saw something he couldn't believe. The mannequin in Spencer's, the one with the business suit, was no longer behind the counter. It had moved. It was now standing right by the gate, its body positioned just like the one he had seen earlier. But this time, its head was turned toward the camera, its eyes locked on the screen. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't imagined it. He hadn't been losing his mind. The mannequin was moving, and it was staring directly at him as if it knew he was watching. Ethan's hands trembled as he walked back to the security desk, trying to ignore the suffocating feeling that lingered in the air. His mind was reeling from the mannequin's strange, lifelike movement, The twitch of its fingers, the shift in its pose. He had broken the rule, hadn't he? Even though he had sworn not to acknowledge them, his feet had carried him back to the mannequin. And now, it seemed as if everything was spiraling out of his control. He sat at the desk, his body heavy with the growing sense of dread, and checked the monitors. The feeds flickered for a moment, the grainy footage from the old cameras on the screen warping with static. Ethan rubbed his eyes, exhausted from the mental strain, but he knew he needed to stay focused. The monitors showed the same darkened corridors and vacant storefronts, the same empty spaces he had walked through 1,000 times. Yet something felt off. He instinctively looked at camera 3, the one that watched the main concourse, a camera positioned above the central hallway, covering the broad stretch of the mall where the majority of the foot traffic had once flowed. But as his eyes settled on the screen, Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The image on camera 3 was different. He stared for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The mannequins outside the Spencer's store, the ones he had passed earlier, were no longer in the same positions. At least, not the way he remembered them. Some of them had shifted. One was standing closer to the gate, another had turned its body slightly to face the camera. And the one in the business suit, the one that had been staring directly at him, was now almost entirely facing toward the concourse, its plastic head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes wide open. The mannequin had been watching him. He was certain of it. And now, it was as if the entire display had moved. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. How is this possible? The mannequins couldn't move. They were just figures, lifeless and plastic. But the footage on the screen didn't lie. The mannequins had shifted. For a moment, he just stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. His mind raced, trying to dismiss it as some sort of glitch, but deep down he knew better. The mannequins were alive, or at least aware, and now they were moving in ways that didn't make sense. Ethan stood up, his legs shaking slightly as he walked to the incident log. The familiar sound of his footsteps in the empty room echoed, each one reminding him of how alone he truly was in this place. He quickly flipped through the pages of the log, his eyes scanning the handwritten entries. He had glanced through it before, but now he was desperate for answers. His fingers skimmed the pages until he found what he was looking for. The most recent entry had been made just a few hours before his shift began. It was a note written in the same neat handwriting as the others, but the words on the page made his skin crawl. 12:05 a.m. Main concourse. Mannequins repositioned. No interaction. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He read it again, his heart pounding. Mannequins repositioned. That was exactly what he had seen on camera 3. But it was more than just a simple note. This had been documented by a previous security guard, someone who had been through exactly what he was experiencing now. But how was it possible? He flipped the page to the next entry. His eyes scanned it quickly. 2:30 a.m. Food court. Chairs moved, noticed in peripheral vision. No action taken. Ethan's throat tightened. Chairs moved. That was the same thing he had noticed earlier. The scraping noise from the food court. The chairs shifting out of place. His heart raced as he recalled the moment when he had passed through the food court and heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. He had thought he imagined it, but now it was in the log. Documented. Real. He kept flipping through the pages, each entry more disturbing than the last. The further back he went, the more similar the entries became. Mannequins repositioned. Chairs moved. Food court. Items displaced, no sign of entry. A Sears department store, mannequins adjusted. The entries were dated from previous shifts, some as recent as a few days ago. Others stretched back months, each one describing the same eerie phenomena. Mannequins shifting, objects moving, the same disturbing patterns. But what struck him most was the tone of the entries. Each note was clinical, precise, as if the guards who had written them had become numb to the strange occurrences. They didn't question it. They didn't seem to care about the unnatural movements, the way the mannequins repositioned themselves, or how the items in the food court had been moved. It was just documented. No commentary, no fear, just routine. Ethan felt a cold sweat on the back of his neck as he read the last entry in the log. 3:15 a.m. Spencer's store. Mannequin in business suit repositioned. Gaze fixed on the security desk. No acknowledgement of anomaly. The entry was from the previous night's shift. Ethan's eyes widened as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The mannequin in the business suit, the one that had been staring at him, had been reported in this exact position before. But the person who wrote this note hadn't acknowledged it. They had simply followed the rule. Don't interact, don't acknowledge. But now Ethan knew. It wasn't just an anomaly. It wasn't just something to brush off. This wasn't a normal night shift. Something was happening here. Something that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or malfunction. The lights above him flickered again, pulling him from his thoughts. The static on the cameras seemed to buzz louder, as if the whole place were vibrating with tension. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything. The mannequins moving, the sounds, the temperatures dropping, the logs, the rules, and now the footage, all of it pointed to one inescapable truth. The mall was alive, and it was drawing him in. He turned back to the camera feed, but his eyes were drawn to camera 7, the one watching Spencer's store. The mannequin in the business suit was no longer standing behind the counter. It had moved, and this time, it was staring directly at him through the camera. Ethan sat at the security desk. The pages of the incident log spread out before him like a map to a dark, unspeakable truth. His fingers hovered over the worn paper, the faintest tremor in his hand betraying the fear gnawing at his gut. The mannequins, the glitches in the cameras, the strange noises, all of it had begun to blend together, leaving him with the overwhelming sense that something was terribly, horribly wrong. As he turned the pages of the log, his mind was clouded with uncertainty. The rule he had been repeating in his mind, follow the rules and you'll be fine, had lost its comfort. Now it felt more like a desperate plea for survival, an attempt to avoid the horrifying fate that awaited those who didn't follow the protocol. But as he flipped the pages, one entry in particular caught his eye. The date at the top was several months old. He hadn't read this one before, but now something made him pause. He squinted at the handwriting, neat and methodical, as if written with a calm, almost detached sense of finality. 3:15 a.m. Employee failed to follow protocol. Made direct eye contact with mannequin in blue dress. Eyes met. Position terminated effective immediately. Employee did not report for second shift. Personal belongings found in security office. Forwarded to next of kin. Ethan's breath hitched, and his pulse seemed to freeze in his veins. He read the entry again, the weight of the words sinking in slowly like a cold stone dropping to the pit of his stomach. Made direct eye contact with mannequin in blue dress. The mannequin, direct eye contact. The words echoed in his mind like a warning bell. He had seen the mannequins and he had felt their eyes on him. He had been terrified by the thought that they were watching him, that they were aware of his every move. But now, reading this entry, a terrible realization began to sink in. The mannequin in the blue dress, the one that had been mentioned in this log, had killed someone. Not literally, but figuratively. The poor employee who had broken the rule and made direct eye contact with the mannequin had disappeared, taken by whatever dark force lurked within these walls. And now, that same fate loomed over Ethan. The entry had ended in a chilling statement. Position terminated effective immediately. Employee did not report for second shift. Ethan's hands clenched around the pages, his fingers numb with fear. The employee didn't report for second shift. That was it. There were no details, no explanation, just a cold, mechanical statement of fact. But the lack of details, the sterile tone of the report, made the situation even worse. It was as if the disappearance of this employee was just another routine part of the mall's operations, something that was expected, something that happened whenever someone failed to follow the rules. The entry felt final, the way you'd log a malfunctioning machine or a broken item. No emotional attachment, just documentation. Ethan leaned back in his chair, trying to steady his racing heart. The words swam before his eyes as the cold grip of realization took hold. The mannequin, the figures he had walked past for hours, the figures he had tried to avoid, were not just lifeless decorations. They were a force of control. They were the enforcers of the mall's strange, terrifying rules. And breaking those rules, even with something as small as making eye contact, had consequences. Terrible, irreversible consequences. His mind spun with the thought of the worker who had disappeared. What happened to them? Had they been absorbed into the mannequins? Had they become part of the terrifying display, frozen forever, just like the other figures? Was there a way to escape the cycle? Or was the only way out to obey the rules without question? The log entry kept coming back to him, its words drilling into his brain like a warning. Position terminated effective immediately. It wasn't just a job, it was a sentence, a punishment. Ethan quickly flipped through more pages, his fingers trembling as he scanned the other entries. He had to know more. He had to understand what had happened to the others who had worked the night shift before him. The entries were all eerily similar. Some spoke of mannequins being repositioned. Others mentioned chairs moved in the food court or strange items displaced in the stores. But each report ended with the same detached tone. No one who had broken the rules had ever returned. Their names were written down, their positions terminated, but there were no explanations, no reasons given for their disappearance. They simply vanished. And the most disturbing part, the log never once indicated that anyone had ever left the mall alive. Not a single report stated that someone had finished their shift, collected their pay, and left like a normal person. No. The entries always ended with a cold note. Employee did not report for second shift. It was like the mall swallowed them whole, consuming those who dared to break its rules, trapping them in its lifeless, shifting halls. Ethan slammed the log closed, his breath ragged in his chest. He stood up, the weight of the information crushing him. He needed to leave. He needed to find a way out of this nightmare. But as he looked around the security office, he felt the oppressive weight of the mall pressing in on him. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence louder. The mannequins, they were still out there waiting, watching. The rules weren't just a precaution, they were a lifeline, a desperate attempt to survive in a place that didn't want him to leave, a place that took everything from those who failed to obey. He gripped the desk, feeling the cold sweat on his palms. He had to finish his patrol, but now, more than ever, he knew that survival wasn't just about doing the job. It was about keeping his mind intact. It was about not breaking the rules, because breaking the rules meant becoming part of the mall, forever. Ethan turned his attention back to the monitors. Camera 7 showed the Spencer's store, the mannequin in the business suit standing at the counter as still as ever. But this time there was a difference. The mannequin's eyes, they were locked on him. And for the first time, Ethan was sure that the mannequin was waiting for him to make his move. Ethan stood frozen in front of the security desk, the weight of the incident log still pressing on his chest. The realization that the rules were a matter of life and death, that the mannequins were not merely static displays but something far more sinister, made his thoughts swirl in a maddening cycle. He knew he had to keep moving to finish his shift, but every corner of the mall now felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to breathe with intent. The air, thick with the chill that seemed to radiate from the walls, pressed in on him. His breath misted in front of him, and despite the haunting stillness, every part of him screamed that something was following him. He forced himself to stand up, his legs stiff and unsteady, as he slowly turned his attention back to the monitors. The cameras were his only link to understanding the full scope of what was happening. But as his eyes moved from one screen to another, something caught his attention. Camera 8, the one watching the jewelry store. There in the dim light, Ethan saw something that made his stomach lurch. The security gate at the jewelry store was bent. The metal bars, which should have been securely locked, were twisted, leaving a gap large enough for someone to slip through. He stared at the monitor, his breath catching in his throat. The gate had never been like this before. He knew it had been intact during his earlier patrol. How long had it been like this? A strange compulsion gripped him. The same feeling he had experienced in the Spencer's store when he had been drawn toward the mannequin began to take hold of him now. He felt an irresistible urge to investigate, to find out who or what had caused the breach. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, the rules flashed through his mind like a warning. Never investigate security breaches alone. He had read it in the protocols. It was a strict rule, one of the few he had kept repeating in his mind since he began his shift. If something went wrong, if the mall's security was compromised, he was supposed to report it and wait for the day shift supervisor, Marcus. He wasn't supposed to go poking around by himself, especially not in a place as alive as this one. Yet, the urge to investigate felt almost overwhelming. Something about the way the jewelry store's gate was bent, the way the shadows hung heavy around it, made it impossible for him to look away. The gap in the gate beckoned to him, like an invitation to step into the unknown. Ethan hesitated, standing in front of the monitors, weighing his options. A sharp, creaking sound echoed from somewhere down the corridor. It was faint but unmistakable. A door opening or perhaps closing. His breath caught in his throat. Was someone there? The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the air seemed to grow colder, more suffocating. He felt the presence again, that constant, gnawing sensation that he was being watched. His eyes flicked nervously to the hallway on the monitor, but nothing was there. The empty corridor stretched before him, silent, undisturbed. But then another sound, a footstep, faint but distinct. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It was coming from behind him. No, he tried to calm himself, to rationalize. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, just the tension building up. The mall had been abandoned for years. There was no one else here, right? And yet the footsteps continued. They were slow, deliberate, echoing behind him like the approach of something waiting. He couldn't bring himself to look. His mind screamed at him to stay focused, to keep his eyes on the monitors, to follow the rules. But the fear was overwhelming and his body refused to listen. His feet felt rooted to the floor, his pulse racing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. He knew he had to look. He had to know if someone or something was behind him. But something stopped him, a primal fear deep inside him telling him not to turn around, not to face whatever was there. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's mind raced. The air in the room seemed to press in on him, suffocating him with its cold weight. His hands were clammy as he gripped the edge of the desk. His eyes flicked between the monitors, desperate for something familiar, something to ground him. But all he saw was the shadowed mall, lifeless, empty, as it had been since he started his shift. Another creak. This time it was louder. The unmistakable sound of a floorboard creaking, a footstep close behind him. He couldn't hold back any longer. Slowly, his body trembled as he turned his head, just enough to glance over his shoulder. His eyes scanned the dimly lit security office, the empty space behind him, but there was nothing. No one. A sense of dread washed over him, deeper than anything he had ever felt. It was as though something was there, something just beyond his sight, lurking in the corners of the room. The air felt heavier, colder, like something unseen was watching him, waiting for him to make his move. Without thinking, Ethan turned back to the monitors. His hand reached instinctively for the radio, trembling as he held it. He needed to speak to Marcus. He needed to report the breach, to tell someone that something was wrong, that he couldn't be alone anymore. But as his fingers brushed the radio, a strange thought stopped him. What if Marcus knew more than he was letting on? What if Marcus had known about the mannequins, the breaches, the rules? Ethan paused. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were survival instructions. And now he was beginning to wonder if the rules were the only thing keeping him alive. The air in the room grew thicker, colder. And then another sound, a soft, breathy whisper, as though it was coming from the walls themselves. "Come closer." The voice sent a chill through his spine, sharp and biting. It was unmistakable, a whisper, a breath right behind him. Ethan's blood ran cold. He was alone. He was sure he was alone, but the voice was real. He could feel it. He didn't move. He couldn't. His whole body felt frozen in place. The mall had already claimed the last shift worker who had made a mistake. What would it do to him if he didn't follow the rules? The footsteps started again, slowly, softly, but this time they were different, not just footsteps, a presence. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather his courage. The rules. They weren't just there to keep him in line. They were there to protect him, to keep him from becoming like the others. He couldn't break them. He couldn't investigate the breach alone. But as the footsteps grew closer, the air colder, the whispers louder, Ethan wasn't sure if he could stay alive long enough to follow the rules. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly. Time had become fluid, slipping by like water through his fingers. Ethan had been working the night shift for what felt like days, but the clock on the security desk told him it was only 3:00 a.m. He had no way of knowing how much longer he had to endure this, but the sense of disorientation, the feeling that he was trapped in some waking nightmare, was growing stronger with every passing moment. The mall, which had once been a silent shell of forgotten commerce, now felt like it was alive. It wasn't just the cold that had taken hold of him, or the flickering lights, or the creeping shadows. It was the feeling that the very walls of the mall were breathing. The faint sounds of movement had intensified. The creaks of doors slowly opening, the scrape of footsteps that weren't his own, the unsettling shift of the mannequins. They all seemed to echo in the empty corridors, moving in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Every corner he turned, every shadow he passed felt like it was testing him. Every time he glanced at the security monitors, something had changed. The mannequins had shifted, not just in position but in their expressions, their postures. And the light overhead would flicker, then steady itself again, only to repeat the cycle moments later. At first, it had seemed like an isolated incident, a flickering light here, a small movement there. But now the mall felt as if it were alive, shifting around him. It wasn't just the objects that moved. It was everything, the air, the atmosphere, the very fabric of the space itself. Ethan had long since stopped trying to explain the phenomenon. His mind couldn't grasp it anymore. He had seen things that didn't make sense, and the rules were becoming less like a guide and more like an anchor dragging him down into the abyss. He had been told to follow the rules, to survive. But survival was beginning to feel like an illusion. The walls were closing in. The mall wasn't just a place anymore. It was a force, a presence that seemed to be guiding him, testing him. He had passed the mannequins earlier, but this time he had felt their gaze follow him, each one locking eyes with him as he walked past, their unblinking stares burning into his skin. There was no way out of this, no escape. He had been here for hours, and each minute that passed seemed to blur the line between reality and nightmare. The fluorescent lights flickered again, casting an eerie strobe effect across the dark hallway. For a moment, the shadows seemed to come to life, warping and shifting in time with the erratic light. Ethan's breath quickened and he reached for the radio, his fingers shaking. The noise from the static filled the small room as he pressed the button. "Marcus," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. No response. He pressed the button again. "Marcus, do you copy?" Still nothing. The static hissed, loud and oppressive, filling the room like an invisible presence. Ethan's grip tightened around the radio, his heart hammering in his chest. Where was Marcus? Was this all part of the plan? Was Marcus in on it? Or was he as trapped as Ethan was? As the lights flickered once more, the door to the security office creaked open. Ethan jumped, his eyes snapping toward the entrance. No one was there. The door had opened slowly, just a crack, but there was no one standing behind it. No one to explain the movement. No one to acknowledge the strange, unnerving sounds that had begun echoing in the halls, the soft footsteps, the scraping of metal across tile, the whisper of something shifting in the dark. Ethan swallowed hard. The temperature in the room had dropped again, but now it felt different. The cold was no longer just a chill in the air. It was a weight, a suffocating pressure that seemed to press against his chest. He could feel the air growing thinner, like the very oxygen was being pulled from the room. He walked toward the door cautiously, every step deliberate, his feet dragging against the floor. He couldn't stay in the security office any longer. The walls were closing in. He had to see what was happening out there. He had to finish the shift. The door creaked again as Ethan stepped into the hall. The flickering lights above him cast grotesque shadows across the walls. As he turned to walk down the corridor, he heard it. The sound was faint at first, a low hum like a vibration coming from the walls. Then the whispers began again. "Come closer." The voice was faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the same whisper from earlier. This time it was louder, more direct, more insistent. "You are here for a reason." Ethan's heart raced as he turned sharply down a hallway, trying to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to be closing in on him. But the whispers followed him. Everywhere he went, the walls seemed to breathe with him. The very foundation of the mall felt alive, as if it had become a sentient being testing him, pushing him. He stopped in front of a broken storefront, the once vibrant colors of the display now faded and peeling. And that's when it hit him. The mall was alive. It wasn't just the mannequins or the whispers or the strange phenomena. It was the mall itself. The air was thick with it. The mall wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a living, breathing entity feeding off of his fear, guiding him through its dark corridors. The mannequins, the shifting shadows, the cold air, they were all part of its design, part of its test. And Ethan wasn't just guarding the mall. He was being tested. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Every moment, every interaction, every step he had taken, it was all part of some twisted game, some dark ritual that the mall itself had set in motion. The rules weren't just there to protect him. They were there to trap him, to consume him. He had thought the mannequins were the key, the thing to avoid, but now he realized that the mannequins were merely the messengers. The mall itself was the real threat. And it wanted something from him, something more than just compliance. It wanted his soul. A sound echoed from the end of the corridor, the scrape of a chair being moved. The sound was familiar, but now it felt different. It wasn't just an odd occurrence anymore. It was a warning. The mall was growing more restless. It was pulling him deeper into its maze, and there was no way out. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood there, frozen in place. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the truth of what was happening. He wasn't just fighting to survive this shift. He was fighting for his very soul. He turned, eyes wide with terror, and took one final look at the mall around him. Its dark, empty halls stretched out before him, endless and suffocating. The mannequins, the whispers, the cold, they were all part of it. They were all the same thing. The mall wasn't a place to protect. It was a prison. Ethan's footsteps echoed through the abandoned halls of the mall as he approached the old Montgomery ward, the most dreaded part of his patrol. The store, long since closed and gutted, had become a hollow shell of its former self. The darkness inside was impenetrable, the air stale and cold. But tonight the store felt different. Tonight it felt alive. The light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Ethan paused at the entrance to Montgomery Ward, the weight of the mall pressing in on him. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent. The temperature had dropped even further, so cold that he could see his breath condense in the air before him. His heart raced and his hands trembled as he stepped inside. He had been dreading this moment since the first time he stepped foot into the mall, but now there was no turning back. He had come too far, seen too much. The mall had already claimed so many before him, each one falling into its grasp, becoming part of its twisted ecosystem. And now it was his turn to choose. As he moved deeper into the store, the mannequins came into view. They stood in rows, perfectly aligned, as if arranged for some kind of grotesque inspection. There was something about the stillness of the scene that made his blood run cold. The mannequins were dressed in various outfits, just like before, frozen in time. But tonight they weren't just mannequins. They were something more. The final row of mannequins caught his attention. They stood taller than the others, their figures rigid and lifeless. But one mannequin in particular sent a jolt of fear through his body. It was dressed in a security uniform. Its face, though made of plastic, looked almost too real. The details were unnervingly precise. The name tag, the badge, the faint shadows around its eyes. And worst of all, it was watching him. Its eyes locked onto his, unblinking. Ethan felt an involuntary shiver run down his spine. For a moment, he couldn't move. It was as if the mannequin was calling to him, beckoning him to step closer, to join it in its eternal stillness. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to take a step back. But the mannequin's gaze followed him. It didn't just stand there, it waited. And with each step Ethan took, the weight of the rules, the weight of the knowledge that he was no longer alone in this place, pressed down harder on his chest. The mannequins are not just objects. The thought hit him like a freight train, and for the first time the true nature of the mall became clear. These mannequins weren't decorations. They weren't just lifeless displays. They were part of something larger, something that controlled the mall, something that controlled everyone who entered its doors. They were the mall's enforcers, the keepers of its rules. They were its eyes, its watchers. And now they were waiting for him to make his choice. The mannequin in the security uniform, it wasn't just a figure anymore. It represented everything the mall had been leading him to. Ethan's mind raced, his thoughts spinning in a chaotic whirl. The rules, the protocols, the strange events, the unexplained phenomena, it was all part of the mall's design. The mannequins, the cold air, the shifting walls, it was all meant to guide him toward this moment. This is the test. The mall wasn't just testing his obedience. It wasn't just watching him to see if he followed the rules. It was offering him a choice that would determine his fate. The mannequins were part of the mall's ecosystem. They were its family. And now he was standing at the threshold of that family, faced with the ultimate decision. He could obey the rules. He could follow the protocols, live out the rest of his life within the walls of the mall, joining the family of mannequins, becoming just another frozen figure in the never-ending cycle. He would be safe. He would be a part of something eternal. But at what cost? What kind of life would that be? To become one of the mannequins, to give up his humanity in exchange for the safety of the mall. Was that really a life worth living? But if he defied the rules, if he tried to escape, to break free from the grip of the mall, the consequences would be dire. He had seen the entries in the incident log. He had read the stories of the night shift workers who had disappeared, who had never reported for their second shift. The ones who had broken the rules, who had dared to look into the eyes of the mannequins, who had ignored the warnings. They hadn't left. They hadn't survived. He would become part of the mall's haunted ecosystem, trapped forever in its twisted world, a permanent resident in the place that had already claimed so many before him. As Ethan stood there, staring at the mannequin in the security uniform, he realized that the mall wasn't just a prison for the soul. It was a choice. It was asking him to make a decision. Would he join the family, becoming a mannequin, a part of the eternal cycle? Or would he defy the rules and risk becoming part of the mall's nightmarish collection of lost souls? He couldn't stay here forever. He couldn't let the mall consume him. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped forward. He could feel the weight of the mannequin's gaze following him, but he didn't stop. He had made his choice. The rules weren't meant to protect him. They were meant to trap him, to turn him into another mindless figure. He couldn't be a part of that. As he walked toward the back of the store, his heart thundering in his chest, the mannequins seemed to shift ever so slightly, as though they were reacting to his decision. He couldn't look back. He couldn't break his stride. He had to keep moving, but the mall wasn't done with him yet. Suddenly, the lights flickered and the whispers started again. Louder, more urgent. The walls seemed to close in around him as he walked through the darkened aisles of Montgomery Ward. The mannequins stood still, but their eyes followed him, their gazes searing through the darkness. Ethan quickened his pace. He had made his choice. He would not join them, but the mall wasn't going to let him go that easily. The mall had always felt wrong, like a shadow of its former self, a place trapped in time. But now, as Ethan stumbled through the empty corridors, every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the dying lights seemed to whisper the truth he had been desperately avoiding. The mannequins weren't just figures. The mannequins weren't just empty shells. They were recruits. The realization hit him like a flood. His heart hammered in his chest as his mind struggled to process the nightmare he was trapped in. The mall wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it needed new souls to keep its twisted ecosystem running. It wasn't just a haunt, it was a prison. A trap designed to pull in the vulnerable, the desperate, the ones like him who had nowhere else to turn. The mall didn't want employees to watch over it. It needed servants, souls who would be frozen in time, their lives taken from them the moment they failed to follow the rules. Ethan's breath quickened as his eyes scanned the space around him, the weight of the truth settling heavily on his chest. He had been living in a nightmare, but it was one he couldn't wake up from. He had made his choice, but now he understood that choice had never been his to make. The mannequins, the shifting walls, the eerie sounds, they were all part of the process of recruitment. Each night shift worker who walked through the doors of Crossroads Mall was destined for one of two fates: obey the rules, join the mall's twisted family, and become just another lifeless mannequin, or break the rules and be absorbed into its haunted ecosystem, forever trapped in the mall's suffocating grip. Ethan's legs trembled as he moved deeper into the mall, the silence around him growing even heavier. The mannequins watched from every corner, their blank faces still and unyielding. But Ethan didn't stop. His path led him toward the back storage area of the mall, where old display racks and unused merchandise were piled high. There, in the corner of the room, he noticed something different: a dusty old box, tucked away on a forgotten shelf. Drawn by a strange, irresistible compulsion, Ethan walked over and pulled the box down. The air around him felt colder as he opened it, his hands trembling as he sifted through the contents. Old photographs, yellowed with age, their edges curling as though they had been stored here for decades. The photographs were of people, but there was something wrong about them. Some of them had been faded and worn away, the faces nearly unrecognizable. Others had been scratched, their features deliberately blurred. But as he flipped through the images, one photograph caught his eye: an old, grainy photo of a security guard, standing in front of the same security desk he had been manning for hours. The man in the photo looked young, fresh-faced, dressed in a security uniform just like Ethan's. Ethan's fingers stopped as he read the caption beneath the photograph: "The last one to break the rules." His heart skipped a beat. He turned the photo over, and there, on the back, written in faded ink, were more words: "Failed to follow the patrol route, engaged with a mannequin." The man in the photograph, the last one to break the rules, had been just like him. A security guard working the night shift, just trying to survive. But the photo told a different story. The man had made a fatal mistake. He had broken the rule. He had interacted with one of the mannequins. And now he was part of the mall, a mannequin just like the others. Ethan's stomach churned as he placed the photo back in the box, his mind reeling. The mall didn't just want to recruit employees, it needed them. And if they couldn't follow the rules, if they made the mistake of looking too closely, of questioning too much, they would be replaced, transformed into mannequins, frozen in time, forever trapped in the mall's twisted cycle. He felt a cold sweat on his brow, the weight of the revelation settling heavily in his chest. All this time he had been fighting to survive, but now he knew the true cost of that survival. The rules weren't just there to keep the mall running. They were there to maintain its control. Every mannequin, every lifeless figure standing motionless in the store windows was once someone just like him, someone who had failed to obey the rules, someone who had dared to look, but it wasn't just the mannequins. The entire mall, with its eerie quiet and shifting walls, was part of a greater system, a system that fed on souls, a system that trapped people in a never-ending cycle of servitude. And the worst part, it would never stop. The mall needed new recruits to keep its twisted ecosystem alive. Ethan's legs gave way beneath him, and he sank to his knees, the gravity of the truth pulling him deeper into despair. There was no escaping this place. There was no way out. The mannequins were waiting, but not just for him. They were waiting for everyone who had ever stepped foot inside this cursed mall. And now he understood. The mall wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, an entity that fed on the souls of those who dared to defy it. The mannequins weren't just decorations. They were the victims. They were the recruits who had failed the test. And if Ethan didn't obey the rules, he would become just like them. A low creaking sound echoed from the darkness behind him, followed by the familiar scrape of footsteps. Ethan turned, his pulse racing. The mannequins were moving again, but this time it was different. They weren't just shifting positions, they were approaching him. Their blank faces turned toward him, their plastic eyes wide and empty. He backed away, his chest tight with fear. The mall was no longer just an abandoned building. It was a living nightmare, and he was its latest victim. Ethan felt the cold air closing in around him, the walls of the mall pressing against him, suffocating him. The mannequins were getting closer, their movements slow and deliberate. And then the whispers started again, louder this time, a chorus of voices, each one beckoning him to join them. Come closer. Obey the rules. Join the family. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the mannequins surrounded him, their cold, lifeless eyes fixed on him. There was no escape, no way out. This was it. The final moment. He had made it this far, but now, as the mannequins closed in, Ethan had to make one last choice. Would he join the mall's family, forever becoming one of the lifeless figures in the endless display? Or would he defy the rules, risk it all, and be swallowed up by the mall's haunted ecosystem? He didn't know if there was a way out, but he knew one thing for sure: he could never let go. He couldn't become one of them. Not yet. Ethan's chest heaved as he stumbled through the winding corridors of the mall, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The mannequins, those once lifeless figures, now moved with purpose, advancing toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Their cold, empty eyes followed his every move, and he could feel the weight of their gaze like a physical pressure on his skin. He had to get out. He had to get out now. The walls of the mall seemed to shift around him, stretching longer, growing darker. He could hear the soft scrape of plastic feet on tile, the hum of the air vents, and the low creaking of the building as though it were alive, fighting against his every move. The mall was closing in on him, each step he took making the distance between him and freedom feel farther and farther. Just one more corridor. The exit was close. He could see it ahead, the faint light from the outside world just visible through the glass doors. The first rays of dawn were beginning to creep in, pushing back the suffocating darkness that had held the mall in its grip for so long. But even as he moved toward it, Ethan knew that escaping was not as simple as reaching the door. The mall wasn't going to let him go that easily. The lights overhead flickered again, casting brief shadows that danced and twisted, making the space feel as if it were alive, as though the mall itself were actively trying to prevent his escape. The air grew colder with each passing second, and the silence that had once seemed comforting now felt like a trap, the calm before the storm. Damn it. Ethan's mind raced, the panic rising with every footstep. He had come so close, but now the mannequins were closing in. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. His feet moved faster, almost as if they were carrying him on their own, desperate to get away from the cold, lifeless stare of the figures that had once been human. The mannequins were relentless, and as he passed by one of them, its eyes flicked toward him. It was watching him, watching his every move. He couldn't stop now. He couldn't let them win. As he neared the exit, the overhead security system malfunctioned. The lights flickered violently, casting the entire hallway in alternating flashes of light and dark. The sound of alarms blared, distorting the silence into a maddening cacophony. The mall was fighting back. The gates to the exit doors had been locked. The heavy, iron barriers were sealed shut. No, 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 no. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he pulled desperately at the locked door, but it wouldn't budge. His mind was reeling, his thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. The mannequins were closing in on him, and now the mall had turned on him, blocking his only way out. He turned away from the doors and looked around the room. The mannequins were no longer just standing idly by. They were moving. Some were advancing toward him. Others stood in his way, silently forming a wall between him and his escape. It was as if the mall itself had drawn them into position like pieces on a chessboard. What did he do? The rules were clear. He was never supposed to deviate from his patrol. He had broken the rules too many times. Now, the price was being exacted. But Ethan had to make a choice: stay and continue following the rules, or break free and risk losing everything. The mannequins' lifeless faces stared at him, their eyes cold and unblinking, but their movements were deliberate now. They had no need for words. They were enforcers of the mall's twisted logic. He realized for the first time that the mall wasn't just testing him. It was trying to claim him, to consume him completely. Every step he had taken, every rule he had broken, had led him here, to the final moment when the mall would either swallow him whole or let him go. Ethan's pulse raced as he looked at the mannequins closing in on him. His hands were slick with sweat, his fingers fumbling against the lock on the exit door. The mall was alive, and it was demanding that he obey its rules. But Ethan had already come too far. He could feel the weight of the rules pressing on him, the relentless tug of the mall trying to draw him back into its cold embrace. The mannequins were almost on him now, their mechanical movements coming closer, the sound of their footsteps growing louder. He had no time left. With one final surge of desperation, Ethan slammed his shoulder into the door, the heavy iron barrier rattling violently. For a moment, he thought he had failed. But then, to his shock, the door creaked open just a crack. Freedom. Ethan wasted no time. He threw his shoulder into the door again, the sound of metal scraping against metal as it finally gave way. He pushed the door open and bolted through, his body moving faster than it ever had before, driven by sheer terror. As he ran into the parking lot, the first rays of daylight greeted him. The bright, warm light of the sun hit his face like a bomb, and for the first time in hours he could breathe freely. He stumbled forward, his legs weak with exhaustion, his chest heaving. The mall Crossroads Mall loomed behind him, dark and silent as if it had never been alive at all. But the freedom didn't last long. As Ethan turned to look back, he realized something was wrong. His vision blurred. The memories of the night, the mannequins, the rules, it all felt distant, fading like a dream he was waking up from. The horrors of the mall were beginning to slip away like sand through his fingers. He stumbled back, reaching for the fleeting memories, trying to hold on to them. But they were already slipping through the cracks of his mind. The details of the mannequins, the cold air, the whispers, they were all starting to fade. It was as if the mall had already begun to erase him, to steal away his memories, leaving him with nothing but a vague sense of dread. No, his mind screamed, but the thoughts were growing fuzzy, incoherent. He stumbled across the parking lot, blinking rapidly. The mall was still behind him, but the sense of urgency, the sense of horror that had gripped him just moments ago was gone. It was fading. The fear that had gripped his heart was now distant, like a nightmare that was slipping away with the daylight. Ethan looked back one last time, but the mall seemed like a distant memory now. It was as if the nightmares had been swallowed by the daylight, and with them, his very ability to remember. And as he walked away from the mall, the first rays of the sun shining down on him, Ethan knew one thing for sure: he had escaped. But what would happen when the sun set again?